Hello, everyone. Welcome to another insightful episode of Kingsgate Break. As you all know it already, this is the podcast series of Kingsgate Advisors Institute. And as you know, I come in every month with guests who are practitioners, experts, professionals, and even cutting-edge leaders in their field to discuss some of the burning and major issues affecting Africa and the global South countries. And today is nothing short of that. It's another insightful episode where we'll be discussing something very important to Africa and even to the countries in global south in general. As you know, my name is Dr. Luampe Pelumi Olanubi. I serve as the executive director of the institute. And if you haven't already at this point, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube page, subscribe to our LinkedIn page, and also our Instagram page. Follow us on Instagram, follow us on LinkedIn, subscribe to our YouTube page, so that you can be the first to know when we record and we upload another insightful episode of this brief. Check us online. You can even check our website to have a deeper view into those things that we've been doing. There you can get to know what we do within the institute and also see how you can be a part of the community. I'm sure there's something we have for you and there's something you can learn from it. So to take the conversation further, today we are talking about something that is very important. Like I said, we're talking about data for policy. How can AI, artificial intelligence, and advanced technologies, how can it strengthen food security in Sub-Saharan Africa? And then also to just set the conversation and set the tone, SSA faced one of the most pressing development challenges of our time, which is food security amidst growing population, climate change, and resource constraints. Now, despite the central role of agriculture in most of these African countries, we've seen that there have been data gaps, insufficient systems, fragmented policies that has continued to undermine the productivity and even the resilience of the region. Advances in AI has also come to play a significant role in helping to solve this problem. AI, data analytics, and digital technology now offer an unprecedented opportunity to strengthen evidence-based policy making in agriculture, from predictive yield models to IoT-enabled sensors, even to remote sensing data. These tools have become very useful and has been transformational in how government, researchers, and even farmers anticipate and mitigate risks. This conversation is going to explore this and much more to see how AI systems can advance design, policy design, improve coordination, and drive agricultural transformation across the region and beyond. Why does this really matter? This is because food security is not just an agricultural issue, it is an economic, it's a social, and it's a governance issue at the heart of Africa's development. Data-driven policy making can bridge the long-standing disconnect between research, insights, and field realities, and even national strategies. However, the challenges remain: weak data infrastructure, low digital literacy, inadequate governance structures, limited collaboration between the public and private sectors. All this has continued to hinder progress. Understanding how technology can be that bridge and can help us address these long-standing barriers becomes so important and pertinent. It's very crucial to achieve this inclusive, sustainable food system across the region. To discuss this and more, I have a very brilliant guest, and you will take it by my words, a very brilliant guest, a researcher, an engineer, and also it's a privilege that he is a member of our board of directors. Today we have Dr. Temitope Odedeyi. Dr. Temitope Odedeyi is a senior research fellow at University College London. Sorry, a minute. Let me just read his full profile. All right. Dr. Temitope is a senior research fellow at the University College London and is the leading voice in the intersection of engineering, digital technology, and sustainable development. He holds a BSc in electrical and electronic engineering from Olabisi Onabanjo University in Nigeria, and he earned both his MSc and PhD from University College London. He is a recipient of the prestigious Nigerian Presidential Special Scholarship for Innovation and Development. His research interest focuses on analysis and design of high-speed telecommunication devices and electronic instrumentation, with applied interest in food quality, prediction, and precision in agriculture. In 2023, he was awarded the Royal Academy of Engineering Research Fellowship, where he leads a groundbreaking 5-year engineering for development project. This initiative is developing IoT-enabled technologies that support data-driven farming and improve cassava yields in Sub-Saharan Africa, advancing food security and climate-smart agriculture. Dr. Odedeyi's work blends between cutting-edge innovation with real-world impact, particularly in Global South, where he's helping reshape the future of agricultural productivity through digital transformation and smart systems. Hello, Doctor. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here indeed. Thank you very much for having me.
All right, that's so good. Yeah, so our viewers, as you would know, by the end of this conversation, we have expectations that you would have had a clear understanding of how data and AI technologies can shape smarter agriculture and food security policies. Also, you'd have had a deeper insight into institutional quality and even ethical considerations in implementing these technologies. You would also be exposed to evidence-based perspective on how Sub-Saharan Africa can build sustainably in tech-enabled food system. And lastly, I believe that a vision for regional collaboration in leveraging data for inclusive agricultural transformation will be one of those things that you'll be taking note today. So it doesn't matter if you're a policymaker, if you're a researcher, if you're a data scientist, a development practitioner, or you're just a student or even an agricultural expert. This is one conversation you want to spend some time to dive right into it. And we are so ready for you. So I would say, let's get started. And by way of starting, Doctor, I want to just, before we go fully into the conversation, I want you to give us a bit of a background into what you've done, what you've been working on, especially in terms of agricultural technology domain. I know you've done a lot of work in that regard. Can you just take us into your world of that so that we can understand the big picture of what you've been working on?
Thank you very much. And I think that's a very good place to start. So my foray into agricultural technology or agri-food electronics, as we term it technically, is started around about 10 years ago. So then I was still an early PhD student, and then there was it started actually with a competition, and the competition was set up by my university, then University College London, and the oldest agricultural research institute in the world, Rothamsted, here, kind of very close to London here. And the idea was to was an hackathon event to develop solutions for agriculture for Africa. And at the start of that competition, really, I didn't have much in my mind of exactly what I wanted to do. But the driving force was, I'm an electrical engineer. They're trying to synthesize or to develop solutions for agricultural technology. I don't have an idea, but it would be remiss. It would be like a crime for me not to be involved. And that was my first step. And thankfully, the idea we came up with then, myself and a team of 3 other PhD students, the idea we came up with then won that competition. So the idea then was, how can we develop a low-cost handheld device to do crop quality measurement that's tailored to a particularly important African crop, which is cassava. And from that step, so we got, it wasn't a lot of money then, it was £10,000 grant. And that was the initial step that really set me up in that direction. And so, and it just went on to continue to build momentum in that area. And the next major step we had was a £100,000 grant from the university, also to then take the idea that we started with to make it a bit more robust, to get it into prototype stage, into a proper device. And then step by step, I was involved in another big grant that was provided by the Horizon Europe framework. This was in a collaboration with 13 other institutions across Europe and Africa called Nesla. So that was a big step, because then we started to look beyond the limited scope of what can we do with cassava. Has been my mandate crop for a few years now. What can we do with cassava, to going to what can we do with different contexts of agriculture under what is called the One Health framework. Essentially, how does quality in how we produce, quality and safety in how we produce food, both crops and livestock, affect human health? And so that kind of broadened my horizon significantly. And after that, as you mentioned earlier, I was privileged to have the fellowship, the Royal Academy of Engineering Research Fellowship under the Engineering for Development Research Framework, which enabled me now to push much more across the application of or adaptation of technologies and development of new technologies targeting Sub-Saharan Africa agriculture. So that's kind of like a very high-level summary of of my journey so far.
Interesting, I must say. What started with just what we can call a small competition had become a major research product that is being used across Africa. That's really beautiful. Now, to build on that, I just want to also ask you, across SSA now, agriculture has remained the backbone of many economies, yet food insecurity persists. How can advanced data systems and AI help governments and institutions design smarter, evidence-based agricultural policies? What can be done?
Okay, that's a very interesting question. And first of all, I have to kind of present a caveat. So I'm going to be speaking mostly with the heart of an electronics engineer, or like an agri-food electronics engineer. I have some experience, or at least some knowledge of policy, how policies are crafted, but I'm not an expert there. So if I step on a few policymaker toes, please bear with me. But I look at this question on 4 fronts, right? And I think many of us, even whether we have a policy background or engineering background, or we're just keen observers, will be able to identify these four points. The first one is that we have mostly a reactive approach to problem solving across many sectors, but it's particularly dire in agriculture, rather than a proactive approach. So our responses tend to be more reactive than proactive. So for instance, we have cases where there's a drought, and then the agricultural production fails significantly in a particular year, and then we quickly start to move to how do we rescue the situation. But robust data systems can actually enable more proactive, a more proactive response approach, where we can predict that there's a high likelihood that we're going to have this kind of problem by this period in this year. And then we start to look at how can we develop a system to help us minimize the shocks and the effect on livelihoods, both for the farmers and of course also for the consumers. So that's a key area where that data can actually make a huge difference, where we become more proactive in our responses. Another area is where we become more, we can actually do more long-term planning, right? And then more long-term structuring to support the agricultural system. So, for instance, I was reading a report and it says, even up till date, a lot of the responses that we have to agricultural shortfalls and challenges tend to be more around subsidies, and the ripple effect of that is we end up creating more problems than we solve. So, for instance, we have say maize fails or rice production fails in a particular year because the rains didn't come on time, right? And then we find a way to subsidize importation and all of those things like that. But we know down the line, we have created a problem for local farm rice production, because now the cost drops. The expectation of the consumer is that this, and so ultimately we have that cycle that keeps coming on. So we invest a lot of money in this short-term solutions, which eventually in the long-term robust systems. So, but data systems also can come in that area, kind of very connected to the first point of how we can be more proactive than reactive. We can also be more long-term. We can be more long-term in our approach to planning than short-term, when we have in place a strong data system, right, that enables us again to see, okay, so what do we expect to see 10 years down the line, 5 years down the line, when we start to invest in agriculture? How do we build up to ensure that we are ready for the things we expect to see in the next 10, 20 years down the line? And also connected to that is, of course, policy. Generally, policy, we need evidence to be able to have strong policy, right? How do we generate this evidence? Data. So to the question of how data systems can help, right? So we know that we want to have robust policies. To have robust policies, we need evidences, right? And the way we gather the evidence is having data systems that can make that data as rich, as robust, as clean, and as also as useful as possible. And of course, when you combine AI, because I remember that your question also includes both data systems and AI. When you include AI, then what that does for us is we're able to also extract intelligence much more quickly. Maybe later down the line, I'll be able to speak a little bit more, because I imagine as the discussion evolves, we get to a few more case studies where we can see how this actually works in practice. I'll add one more point to this. The final point I'd like to add in that sense is transparency, right? There's still a little bit of course, the opposite of transparent is opaque. So let's say opaqueness in how our policies are being made. And I think when we see, oh, this is the data that is guiding why we are putting this kind of investment in this particular country, in this particular region of the country, rather than this other particular region, right? You know, I think many of us can relate with coming from a multicultural setting like most African countries are. There's always that sense of, why is it that all of this investment is going in this direction rather than in this direction? Why are they supporting this particular place rather than this particular place? But when we have like data that has been collected in a very transparent way, and the data speaks clearly that this is the area where we must invest if we are going to be able to safeguard our food security for the next 10 years, right? Then people, I imagine that people are a bit more amenable to supporting those frameworks, rather than when these things are completely absent or not being adequately used. Thank you.
Very beautifully put it together. They are like the 4 points that you mentioned. And you know, as you were talking, you touched a little on data. And I want us to probably zoom in a little more on, you know, you talked about data systems. I want us to talk about data and gaps, data gaps that we've identified. In your own experience, you know, based on the research you've conducted, and generally when it comes to food security and the likes in Africa, what are the most significant data gaps that are undermining food security planning process in the region? And how can AI be leveraged, or other emerging digital technologies? How can we leverage them to fill in these gaps when it comes to data? I know you've done some things in that regard, so please, let's hear your thoughts.
Thank you for that question. And this one, I think I'm going to help you with this question. Let's start first with talking about the gaps. And then after I talk about the gaps, then you can ask again, like, how do we use it? Because if I try to put them together, I might get lost. So,
it's okay. Let's try the gaps then.
Let's look at the problems first. What are the key challenges that we can easily, or at least we can identify, or may not even be very obvious to many of our listeners or viewers? First one is the fact that agricultural production, in a sense, because of the generally free markets, at least a significantly free market structure and framework that the world tends to operate in right now, every form of production, in a sense, is a competition, right? So there's always, like, so Nigeria wants to say, or Ghana wants to invest in, or we want to move much more strongly into the production of palm oil, for instance, right? Then they're going to have the problems of how do we ensure that we are producing this competitively to justify the investment in that direction, right? And that's where you start to see the kind of gaps that we have. So first of all, so let's use that. Let's pick that example. So say a country picks Ghana, and it's not like as if I'm saying that Ghana. I'm just using just an hypothetical case to help us understand this problem. So Ghana says, I want to start to invest much more in palm oil production now. And now Ghana is going to be competing with existing superpowers or muscles in that area. So now imagine that Ghana has to deal with the fact that the amount of data that they have regarding the environmental situation, like environmental data. So like, okay, so for this particular region that we're earmarked to be the hub or the hotspot for our palm oil intentions, we don't have enough data or environmental data of what the climate patterns are in that region. The soil data that we have was the soil data that we had like in 1980. Again, I'm speaking hypothetically, but if you do a bit of research, you see that the hypothesis is not very far from the reality. But again, because these are very interesting discussions to be had. So first of all, that the environmental data, amount of environmental data we have is not really very strong. So we do know that we have hot, wet, and dry season, but exactly what is the how do this actually map as it mapped for the last 10, 15 years, which becomes the leverage or like the starting point to predict what we expect to see for the next 15 years is not particularly strong. Then we have the problem of our soil data, because soil data is something that's always continually shifting, it's continually changing, right? Because especially when we are looking at regions where we're already farming, right? So we won't say we're already farming coffee here or cocoa or cassava here, and now we have earmarked that this is like our best place for where we want to further our intention for farmer production. So then also we have the fact that how do we actually then map these environmental conditions, both environmental and soil data, to yield for the different species or different genotypes. By genotypes, I mean like, say we want to plant this particular variety of palm oil. So which one should we be planting, right? Which one would actually do best in this particular region as opposed to this other particular region, right? And then what are the kind of pest and disease problems that we are going to be facing if we wanted to do these things? And then how do we ensure that we optimize the market condition around this place that we want to set up as the main region to farm? So now I use that hypothetical case to kind of help us understand the scope of the problem, how much data can help, but how much we still have to do in being able to fill these gaps, because actually all of these things I've itemized. So these 5 points, environmental data, soil data, the fact that how do we actually historical yield data and historical yield patterns, our understanding of pests and diseases and biological threats, our understanding of the market structure around the different crops we want to plant, right? All of these areas are actually areas of weaknesses to different degrees across Sub-Saharan Africa. And so if we're going to actually then be able to, maybe I can now start to talk about how, because that's like the second part of the question now, how we now move into the application of AI and emerging digital technologies in this area. So we probably have heard a lot about how much satellite data is already making a huge difference in agriculture. We've heard some of us might have heard how we have unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, as support systems for gathering all this kind of data. We've heard of so we have those kind of things. We also have IoT systems. So IoT systems for agriculture are Internet of Things. It means you have these sensors that you put in the field, and that these sensors can collect environmental data and then automatically transmit it to a cloud repository where it makes it easy for farmers to be able to remotely access the data and then use it for planning, right? But these things are not, they are actually quite cost intensive, right? But we do need to have these things. We do need to have them, and we do need to have them optimally provisioned for us to be able to get the level of data, or at least the quality of data that we need for strong decision making, and also, of course, for policy making. And then AI also, as we mentioned earlier, kind of broached earlier, that helps us to be able to interpret and then extract value to fill these gaps. So in a sense, whereas we needed to have like a huge amount of deployment. In fact, one of the projects I've been working on recently is how do we make sure that we can synthesize very high quality environmental data so that we can minimize the amount of investment we need to make in deploying physical infrastructure. So that's one of the work we have paper, and we are actually getting some quite good progress. There are a lot of other people working in this area. So what are the artificial intelligence frameworks or algorithms that we can deploy or we can adapt that can help us to optimize this investment so that we get the kind of quality and we get it as quickly as possible?
A lot of work is actually going on there. You can, from your responses, I can tell that a lot of frontier are being shifted, and we are looking forward to see this. But I'm just so curious again to think, now I'm thinking from the policymaker side of things, that how does all this technology, information, data, and the likes, how much of this influence policy making? I believe that there's still sort of gap between this research and the results of the research and policymakers when you're making policy that influences agriculture and other related sectors. So many policy decisions still rely on outdated or incomplete information, if I will put it that way. And how can we use real data, real-time data, and this predictive analytics? How can we use them to influence policymaking? And how can we get them across to the hands of those that actually do policies? When you talk about climate risk and talking about smart agriculture, there are some policies that are embedded to allow this happen. So how do we bring this information, from the research angle to policymakers to see the impact that we really want to see, basically in agriculture and similar sectors?
Hey, that's another very important question, and I'm going to answer this one kind of contemplatively. Again, because it's not my core research area, but again, as a practitioner in the field, we've seen things that seem to work much better than some other things. One of the things I think seems to work much better is where we have a multidisciplinary approach or a multi-agent approach to solving the problem. So multidisciplinary means that we are looking at not just we are not just listening to the voices of the agronomists or the people that understand crop scientists and things like, or soil scientists or crop scientists. We're looking at how do we bring all of this expertise together, right? Because when we bring them together, that we actually know what really matters, right? But that's the multidisciplinary research approach. But we also need the multi-stakeholder approach. Right? I think on the multidisciplinary approach, where we have interactions across different sectors of knowledge, I think we are kind of recognizing that has to happen. The place where, particularly, I think my experience, again, for Sub-Saharan Africa is where we now move much more strongly towards the multi-stakeholder approach, where we now have the farmers at the table, we have the policymakers at the table, right? And then we have all the scientific strength, because we have like very strong scientific frameworks, right? Right. But we need to get everyone together so that there's an understanding of exactly what are these people, so that the policymaker can say, well, this is exactly what these people have found, right? And that can now influence their approach to policy making. Because I think that's the key button, and I can experience it in being a little bit involved at the borders and kind of making my early forays in that space. Makes it very clear that it's a very, very difficult. It can be a really challenging thing to do. Because first of all, the fact is that we don't even speak the same language, right? The language of the electronics engineer and language of the agronomist are not exactly the same. And so when we now bring a politician into the mix, then you have a different problem. But what that has meant is where we have that gap in that siloed thinking has meant that oftentimes we just revert to old systems that work. And I like how you frame the question where you talk about the fact that we rely on outdated or incomplete information. So essentially, we're just basing a lot of, and I say a lot conservatively, right? It's often based on, okay, what was the last thing we know that worked? Whereas we know that everything has shifted. In fact, one of the things that we thought would not shift, which is like the weather patterns, has shifted significantly. And so that's kind of created a problem where we have systems that don't actually work. And definitely real-time predictive analytics, as you frame the question, will make a huge impact, but it can't just make a huge impact on its own. It is when we have this multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder engagement that we can begin to shape our structures and our framework to get to address the risks that actually are impending.
You know, I can agree less with what you said about multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary engagement and multi-stakeholder, because like you said, everyone still lives from his or our own perspective and your own perception. So you're on what side that you are on affects how you see things. And you know, as policymakers, you know, let me use the word, they build policy based on information they have. And if you don't have the cutting edge information, if you don't have the accurate information, you might be obsolete in your policy making. And what solution you're trying to drive at or the problem you're trying to solve, you might actually see yourself creating more problems. So I agree with that. And that also leads to the next question on how we can actually do that. Because I would think what will come to mind is maybe academic forum. But academic forum, the language they speak there is not the same as what you expect to bring, especially in the likes of Sub-Saharan Africa, where we have small older farmers. We're not talking about subsistence farming here. So how can we leverage private sector, maybe associations or groups? How can we leverage that to ensure this collaboration? And how can we bring particularly, this, let's put in context SSA, the smallholder farmers and other associations that we have. How do we bring them to tell us, maybe academically, or just tell us in a way that we can understand what the problem are? How do we enable such engagement? I just want to know. And also in a way that they get access to the resources that they could use in terms of leveraging cheap AI that they can actually use. How, and I know you've done some work regarding that. How do we get that to the farmers, and how do we get the farmers to the policymakers? How do we enable that kind of policy making? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. How? I know I like how you have already framed it as this is a difficult question to answer. And I think first of all, the key thing is the will. I think actually across Africa, I think it's becoming glaring that this has to happen. And because it's becoming glaring that it has to happen, the will is becoming stronger and stronger, right? And once the will gets strong enough, we know we are going to overcome all the barriers that we have, right? But when it now comes to, okay, so what are the actual steps that we'll have to take to overcome those barriers? I think one of the ways that we have often solved this kind of problems, because I think if you look at the journey of humanity there in the earth, especially if we look at what has happened since the Second World War, a lot of frameworks just started to spring up that has enabled us to maintain a lot of things that would have been very difficult to even imagine before the First World War, right? Partnerships, the United Nations project, and all of this, the things like the World Health Organization, all of this integrate. It's very easy to take it for granted that all of this integrate. I'm kind of speaking first of all very broadly before I then go to more specifically. Like if you look at before the 1800s and then 1890 up to the 1890s, like very, very difficult to imagine the kind of alliances, global alliances that have now been forged that we now take for granted, right? And I think that's a testament to what can happen when there is a strong will to achieve some things, right? So my short answer is frameworks. We need to have frameworks in place that enables us to convene the different expertise, interests, and stakeholder groups. It has to be frameworks like rules of engagement, so to speak. That this is how we're going to work together. This is how we're going to make sure that every voice is heard, right? This is how we're going to make sure that we don't leave out any key sector. Definitely the private sector is probably the biggest player in this. If you're going to look at long-term, in terms of long-term planning, it's definitely the biggest player. The government intervention as important as it is, cannot be the main. In fact, that is the reason why most of our approaches have been short-term, right? It's been more reactionary. Okay, let's just slap subsidy on this problem. let's just give all the farmers some money. Let's just subsidize the cost of fertilizers and all of those things like that. Is because that's as much as, or not as much, but that's like a typical government response. But when we start to bring in the role of the private sector, begin to look a bit more forward thinking in our approach. I was privileged to be part of the launch of an initiative by the Commonwealth. So the Commonwealth, of course, we have 21 countries out of about 50 Sub-Saharan African countries as part of the Commonwealth. So of course, it's not every Sub-Saharan African country that's there, but at least there's a major Sub-Saharan Africa interest in the Commonwealth. And so they launched, was the launch of the National Agricultural Data Infrastructure. And the idea of that system was to kind of create a system for agriculture, for collecting agricultural data and considering it as a national asset. So in a sense, it creates a framework for, okay, so we have every different sectors and different people, in fact, at the private level, at government level, collecting agricultural data, right, or holding agricultural data for many years. How do we have a system that is reliable, that's interoperable, and that can support better policy and investment decisions? So essentially, we have this hub where we can feed all these different data. So like we have hubs that have frameworks in place that can then become channels to feed all different data from different sources into a system that everyone that needs data for different reasons can go to that hub and access the data that they need to do whatever it is they need to do. Again, it could be government, for government policy, it could be for I want to invest in this particular sector, or I want to start this particular initiative. Where is the data that I need to build my case, right? We have this NAGDIT is called. So again, National Agricultural Data Infrastructure, and you can go look at it. I was at the launch, and it kind of opened my mind to how important frameworks would be in determining how fast we can move and how successfully we can move, right? Because again, for many of the things that we need to do, we don't actually have the frameworks in place to be able to do them successfully or reliably. And so we have to think more frameworks rather than just say, let's convene. We need to have frameworks even for our convention. So we want to convene. We need to have like frameworks in. So how do we ensure that all the voices are heard? Right? How do we ensure that all the infrastructure we already have in place can be used harmoniously? We can put things together in a way that how do we ensure that we are able to also validate? Like we are sure that the data that we have is actually good data, rather than data that's been collected in a way that makes it compromised, or we can't really make strong inferences on them. So I think in short, as I started, my answer to that question of how public and private stakeholders can collaborate to ensure that we maximize agricultural data is actually how do we set up the frameworks that makes this possible. And I think, again, we have different examples we can learn from. I kind of just shared NAGD as an example of what I have seen, but also we look across different sectors. Right? What are the frameworks that we have that enables us to be able to have the kind of impact that, like, again, I'm very careful to mention sectors now, because different sectors have different attacks. But like we like the World Health Organization, and I just mentioned that as an example. So what is the framework that we have in place? It enables doctors to be able to feed information there, and enables governments to be able to receive directives there. What are the frameworks we have in place? So that at least we have those as examples of what we can then adapt to enable this kind of partnerships, both at the local, national level, and also across the continent and across regions.
That's really brilliant. That's really brilliant, because I agree with you. Frameworks actually help to build systems that is replicable, across sector within sector, across a country within countries. And such framework not only allow public-private partnership in that regard, it also helps to build structures and systems. And the fact that farmers can now, okay, there's sort of a structure now that I can always go to get informed. So it's not just about try and error or luck or what my experience teaches me alone. There is a structure where I can learn from. And also government has also a structure where they can get the real information that they need in policy making. That's really good. And I want to take that forward. And now I want us to just talk a bit more on farmers, particularly in rural African country context. Now, many farmers in rural Africa lack access to digital tools and connectivity. How can we ensure inclusivity? Because I believe that is important when we talk about data-driven agriculture. How can it benefit smallholder farmers, not just the large-scale or producers? How do we bring those high-end technology, Internet of Things and the likes, how do we bring it to a farmer, say in Nigeria, in Kaduna, or in a local environment in Ghana or any other African country like that? How do we bring those technologies to them, and how do they assess it, in a way that is sustainable?
Okay, thank you very much for that one. My first approach to that question would be to say that my experience is that our farmers are very, very interested. They are very curious, and they are very open, right? And that's because farmers are facing problems now that they have not faced. At least the people that trained them didn't face quite the same problems that they are facing now, right? The impact of the climate change, like the evolving climate, has been particularly strong in the last 20, 30 years than we've ever had it, at least in a more recent history. So, and when you notice that your livelihood is at stake, you become very interested, right? So, but then the question now is, how do we ensure that interest translates to actual action on their part? Because that's where it comes like inclusivity. I mentioned earlier in the discussion that, right, so the investment that is going to make these data systems that we're talking about, that will eventually enable stronger policy and more forward-looking policy, is actually quite expensive. It's often beyond the cost that a smallholder farmer can bear. And as we know, the agricultural system across most of Sub-Saharan Africa is heavily smallholder farming. They strongly smallholder farmer model. And I think it's actually not a disadvantage in a sense. Of course, there are a lot of disadvantages with that, but in terms of how that enables people to be at least reasonably employed, it's an advantage, because we have like a huge amount of, the population is actually quite big, and we need to employ labor. So if we have the smallholder farming model as a way for people to have some gainful employment, I think then the approach should be, rather than trying to discourage that and then move into a more, we should find a way to strengthen that model to ensure that we keep people employed, right? As a transitionary phase to where we need to be, where we become a lot more mechanized or at least more mechanical driven than people driven. So that said, it becomes that the problem then is, how do we ensure that the technologies that we are looking at then are accessible to the farmers? So by accessibility, we are looking at, is this something that the farmers can reliably obtain themselves, as in can reasonably obtain within the cost, can be provisioned for them within the cost brackets that they can actually pay for, right? Accessibility also can be thought about in terms of the ease of use. How sophisticated are these systems? So to make it more practical, so say for instance, now we say we have this problem of limited agricultural data from this particular sector of the country, right? Now, we could have the approach of, okay, so let's get the government to invest in deploying sensors in the field, and then just putting all of these things there. But that kind of just half solves the problem, because then the cost of installing, the cost of maintaining, the cost of ensuring that tampering is minimized and all of those things like that, who's going to bear that, right? So what we want to be thinking about is, how do we ensure that these technologies can actually flow through the farmers into the field and be managed by them, so that the farmers can take ownership for those things. So that's what happened. It has to be then that we create a system that makes the farmer, first of all, appreciate how important these things are for their own long-term sustainability, as in survival, or their food security or economic security, and also enable them to be involved in bearing some of the cost, because they are going to be bearing the advantage, and also make it easy for them to be able to deploy, right? So my experience, as I mentioned earlier, around developing crop quality devices. So the particular story that got me into agri-food electronics was, cassava, right? Cassava, as we know, across most of Sub-Saharan Africa, is a key staple crop, right? I imagine that you also, like me, grew up eating some kind of cassava product. If it's not eba, it is fufu. And then there's the gari that we drink most afternoons. You just come from school and you just take your gari, put it inside water, and if you're buoyant enough, you add groundnuts, peanuts, and then we grew up with these things. But then over time, the industrial use of cassava started to also evolve. So we're looking at cassava for excuse me. So cassava for industrial starch production, cassava for sweeteners, and all of those kind of things. In fact, cassava for biofuel production, right? And that meant that we now have a parallel market for cassava that actually could generate more income for the farmer, so that now they know we can sell to the local market where it's food. We can also have like a parallel production where we target the kind of varieties that the industrial processors need for their industrial processes. Now, the bottleneck we found is for you to sell cassava into the industrial markets, right? You need to understand starch content, right? Because the industrial buyers, they don't pay based on bulk weight. They pay based on the starch content, right? So that means that farmer A, let's say farmer Ajadi, can go to the industrial processors, and then they sell they buy his own produce, say 10 tons, they buy it for $500, right? And then farmer Bukayo, farmer Ajadi got $500. Farmer Bukayo comes, and farmer Bukayo got $250. And then farmer Ajishafe had the worst of it all, because when farmer Ajishafe got to the processing plant, they said, "Oh, you have brought a particularly weak produce. The starch content is so low that you cannot even justify buying it, because you're going to get a very low starch yield." So farmer Ajishafe gets turned back at the gates. So now farmer Ajishafe, Ajadi, and farmer Bukayo are now discussing what happened. You understand? So now we came in with the idea of, let's create a system, a device, a low-cost device that enables every farmer to be able to test their starch content in the field, right? And because the farmers understand the problem, it became clear when we started to engage with them that if we can do this for us, then we will try our best to be able to come up with whatever cost is going to be. But eventually the experience we found was that, because, as I mentioned earlier, that the cost of any new technology can be often prohibitive. We still had that problem of how can we make this low cost enough for the farmers to be able to adopt. And if we can't make it low cost enough, what are the market models that we can design, right, to ensure that it still becomes accessible to the farmers? And I think those kind of thinking, because I have to start rounding up, I think I've kind of spoken quite long on this particular topic, and it's because it's an area that I'm very passionate about. Those kind of thinking of how do we ensure that this technology is not out of reach of the smallholder farmers, because otherwise what we are going to create is another way where we have like a short-term intervention that creates long-term problems. Because if we keep technologies that are useful for the farmers or the smallholder and medium-holder farmers out of their reach and makes it more only accessible to much industrial scale farmers, right? Essentially, we continue to increase the pressure on these people, and then they get discouraged, and then we create the ripple effect of greater unemployment, which of course progressively is increasing. So we have to think accessibility in terms of cost. How do we ensure that either we're able to make the cost of these technologies as low as possible, not just low as possible, affordable, or we create market entry or business models that enable perhaps an aggregation of these farmers to be able to do this, to be able to access this technology, and also make sure that we are creating technologies that are accessible in terms of ease of use. And that's another thing that drove our own my own intervention, looking at how do you ensure that this device, whether at any level of literacy, you can use it and interpret what is happening. You know what to do with it. You don't have to go and then sit under a lot of lessons before you understand how to operate the device. So those kind of thinking must underpin our approach. I'll say one more thing. So there's an intervention that I'm also familiar with. This is from the Sustainable Trade Initiative, IDH. So IDH is sponsored by the government of Netherlands. And you can look them up on the internet. So one of the things they do, they've been a partner with us at UCL, my university, in agricultural research. And one of the things they do is they look at different possible technology interventions, or different, and doesn't have to be core technology. It could just be frameworks or structures, systems or market models that can be successful, that can work with farmers. And then they support the introduction of these interventions. So they support so essentially get farmers to be able to relate, or at least get an idea of how this works, support training, support interventions, so that there is an easier access. It's a completely non-for-profit organization. So it's not their interest there is not how much money, or but to ensure that if this is a model that can work, how do we ensure that it gets to where it needs to get to? What are the things that the makers of technology need to factor in, and how can we support them to do it so that the farmers are included in the process of the innovation, and then we maximize the potential for success. One of the things that they did, and I'm rounding off on this thought, is that I learned about is the block farming model. So block farming essentially is, so if you want to do any kind of mechanization, it's very difficult to do mechanization for a farmer that has maybe 2 hectares or 5 hectares of land. So what they did is, let's aggregate all the farmers in this particular, they call it the block farming model. So let's aggregate all of these farmers so that we have like contiguous arable land that is enough to justify mechanization, introduction of mechanization. So we now have like a huge swath of land that will be up to maybe 50 or maybe even more farmers. And then all of them come together under one umbrella. So when it's time to do any mechanization effort, it is coordinated across and then the benefit goes to all the individual farmers. So whereas it would have been one big player buying off all the land and then mechanizing, we still retain the structure of the small and medium older farmers, but the benefits gets to them also. And I think those kind of interventions will be very important in the whole framework of how we get data and how we get policy, how we get all those interventions to support more robust and sustainable food system across Sub-Saharan Africa.
I love it. A lot of solutions here and there. We've seen a lot of innovative solutions. Like I used to tell my people that innovative solution is not a buzzword, right? We are actually seeing these solutions here and there to solve a problem, and that's something that I look forward to seeing in SSA more. Countries like Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, and other farming, agricultural region that way. We've had interesting conversations so far. We've talking about data. We've talked about data. We've spoken about stakeholder engagement. We've spoken about how to bring frameworks, building frameworks, AI, the use of AI and the likes, even farmers and the likes. So I want us to turn to the side of the government now. I want us to talk a little about how governments can increasingly adopt AI for decision making, which are ethical, that has ethical or governance measures in order to safeguard data privacy, because that's very important in this age and time. Data privacy, accountability, and public trust. So how can government or initiatives by governments, in that way, how can they adopt AI in decision making and also safeguarding data privacy and accountability, and to ultimately build public trust when it comes to sustainable agriculture and the likes? Is the question clear?
Yes. And I think it's one of my perspective, one of the simpler questions you've asked me today. And why I say it's not a particularly difficult question is because in the agricultural sector, of course, there's financial interests involved that is actually quite strong. But the level of the level of, how do you put it, the level of, I'm trying to look for the right word. So, but the level of complexity or the need for issues like privacy and issues of issues of fairness and this kind of things is not nearly as strong as when we all like issues of particularly privacy, because I think when we come to data collection, a key issue is always privacy. How do you ensure that the ethics of the data collection, right? But compared to systems where we are collecting health information, like human health information or financial data, right? We both can realize, at least we both can agree that the level of the problems that we created if agricultural, like the soil data gets leaked, is nothing compared to what happens if someone's health data or someone's financial data gets leaked. Like it's not nearly as comparable, right? And if we already have systems in place that have been able to help minimize the risk, of course, it's still an ongoing problem. So this is not to minimize the scale of the problem, right? But if we can do it with a reasonable amount of success in the financial services sector, in the health sector, then it means that we already have good starting points to achieve similar ends when we come to agricultural data. Right. So I think it's typically the same rules will apply, but at smaller and like at least at a lower level of complexity, and then the severity of impact when there's a breach. Right. We still need to ensure that the data is collected in a way that that we minimize biases. We want to make sure that there are clear privacy rules in place when we are collecting data, as we have to do with every data structure. People that we are collecting data from need to know what we are going to be using the data for, right? And it has to be, we don't take people's data. You know, all of this government bring, like we have the very robust GDPR rules that governs data use across Europe. Right. So we have this kind of frameworks that we can actually leverage on, so we don't have to start from scratch. So, excuse me. So I think essentially is to ensure that we are learning from the best practices, because I think, in a sense, because of the fact that the amount of risk that we face in this particular sector with data breaches, at least is a little less tenuous compared to much more difficult scenarios, right? I think then we have like a good place to start up, to build up from. So I'll keep that answer short, because I think, in a sense, just from my perspective, I think it's not the biggest, it's a concern, but it's not like one of the biggest hindrances or concerns that we have to deal with.
I agree with you, actually. I agree with you. When it comes to data related to agriculture, it's not as delicate as health-related information or financial related information. So I totally agree with you. But nevertheless, not regardless, we still have to be careful, and we still have to be cautious when we handle such data. Good. We are heading towards the end of the entire conversation. It has been so insightful, so rich, and thank you for sharing and not holding back. So I have two more questions. I'll take it one after the other. The first is for you to share examples of African countries or regional initiatives where data-driven systems have successfully influenced agricultural or food security policy. We want to see what are the success stories that we've had so far. You can just share in a minute or two. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think here and there we'll find that at different levels we have different degrees of intervention with different levels of success. I think one of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that keeps coming up in terms of, these people are doing quite well, or a few countries that keep coming up that these people are doing quite well, I think Rwanda will be one of those countries. And one of the interventions that they have is something, I believe it's called Rwanda Soil Information Services. And essentially, the idea is to have a system where they can continually get reliable data on soil information. So it's not like individually managed, it's managed centrally, and then you have access to the soil data that can influence your agronomy. How do you produce your crops, your timing of your planting, timing of your harvesting, the interventions you need to do in terms of fertilizer usage and those kind of things. So like a centralized resource, right, that enables people to understand, different stakeholders to understand the state of their soils at a local level. Right. So I think that's a very key one, because remember, as we started this conversation, one of the areas we talked about is, so we have all of these different soil, the state of the soil is continually changing depending on what you're using the soil for. How do you ensure that you have a good enough understanding of the state of your soil before it will determine what you should be planting, when you should be planting it, and essentially what intervention you need to ensure that you maximize your yield. So that example is, I think, is a very good example. And the fact that it is centrally managed means that the cost is also centrally borne, because the cost of doing soil analysis, even for us that we are, for me, I do funded research, and part of my research I do with the International Institute for Tropical Agriculture in Ibadan, Nigeria. And so one of the days we needed we were doing a particular trial that had to do with some yield modeling. I wanted to do the soil analysis. And when I got the bill for the soil analysis, it was like, as the typical Yoruba person would say, this is something, right? So a system like that makes it easier. So I'm looking at the fact that we do have a similar amount of research funding to do agricultural, the research that we're doing. But even at that, we looked at the cost of the soil analysis for not a particularly huge tract of land. Okay, how is the farmer going to afford this? So that kind of intervention from Rwanda is a great one. And then we have all of these long-running trials, like there are trials that have been running in the IITA as an example for decades on crop breeding. Right, so they've been doing crop breeding trials to develop new varieties or genotypes of crops that would have different traits, such as maybe a very high yield, drought tolerant traits, disease resistance traits, and things like that. So we have this kind of projects that have been going on, and what they do is they do all of the trials, validation of these new varieties, and then they release it into the field for the farmers to use. That's a key aspect of how we have examples of where we have data-driven systems, because these crop trials, yield trials are very heavily data-driven. I've been privileged to look at how they collect the data and how the level of detail that's involved in the data, how it's reported, and how it is curated, archived. It's brilliant. So we have this kind of systems that regionally, we have them also nationally. I also done some work with the Crop Research Institute of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in Ghana. It's based in Kumasi. They're kind of also affiliated with the CGIAR framework that IITA is a part of. And so we see this kind of systems that actually behind the scenes, we don't see them often. We just know that they're there. But a lot of the fact that we still have food in the region is down to this effort. And now these efforts also are being supercharged by data-driven systems to ensure that their own work also becomes much more streamlined, much more robust, and is able to deliver much more impact. I also want to mention one more. I was going through from Nigeria, the National Agricultural Technology and Innovation Policy. So NATIP, it was kind of written as a forecast of what the Nigerian government wants to be doing policy-wise for agriculture from 2022 to 2027. How closely they've been able to match the forecast, I can't say specifically, but it's great to have at least a guiding framework. It says, okay, so these are the things we have to be doing. And then these are the kind of responses or interventions we want to be involved in. And these are the outcomes we're expecting. And I think that's also a good example of initiatives that can help that can strengthen agricultural and food security policy. And to close, I think I mentioned earlier the NAGD, which is like National Agricultural Data Initiative, that's been spearheaded by the Commonwealth. And the idea again is creating structures that enables this regionally and nationally to be able to maximize the potential that other data holds for food security across the region.
Thank you. And this brings us to the last question for today. It's been a robust conversation, really. And personally, I have some research to do after this conversation. I need to check up a lot of things that are happening so that one, not just informed, it also help you in your own research, as we continue to work within the Institute. So I want to ask you, looking forward to 2030, 2040, can you just paint the picture for us? What could a truly data-informed agricultural policy ecosystem look like for SSA? One that balances innovation, sustainability, equitability, and even climate resistant and climate friendly agriculture. Can you just paint the picture of what it will look like in the next, say, 20 years? Agriculture will look like, in Africa and beyond. What we want to see, what we really want to see.
That's a brilliant question. Because I like to dream. So I think the dream is actually not so far-fetched, right? So let me lean in as I start to dream now. Yeah, so what are we looking at? What do we want to see? What will a truly data-informed agricultural policy ecosystem look like? I think it's not very complicated, not very complex. The key thing is we need to have policy ecosystems that, first of all, caters to the contextual need, or caters to the need contextually. So what I envision that to mean is that we have policy that has been trained to use machine learning language on local context and local data, so that we have systems across the region that is actually built around our extant needs, the things that we actually need, right? And that in itself will now become like a structure or a system that enables the inclusive partnerships. So private sector, public sector, research organizations, the financial sector, all of these things to be able to contribute maximally, right? So oftentimes we have the lopsided kind of contribution where there's a heavy reliance on foreign investment or contributions and things like that. I believe that a strong data-informed agricultural policy ecosystem starts to help that balance to be achieved, right? And then where I had one more point, because I could go on and on this one, and I remember how long we said we want to have this discussion for, right? But the key point, the third point I want to add to that is where we have every player understanding they actually are contributing to the success of the whole, right? So that particularly the farmers, we kind of tend to end, and small and medium order farmers particularly, can get the impression that they are actually part of a thriving ecosystem, and their voices are informing the responses that they are getting, right? So like that system, I think will be truly remarkable if you're able to achieve that. And I think it will make a huge impact across our food system in Sub-Saharan Africa. Because we know most of the projections are actually not particularly optimistic. Right? When we hear, so we are going to have this population explosion by 2035, and then we're expecting all of these things to happen. And then at the same time, we're going to be facing the worst climate induced variations that we've ever faced in recent history, right? So we have the explosion of growth and then more stress on our existing infrastructure. But actually, I think it's also an opportunity. And the opportunity there for us is where we create a system that enables the kind of interventions that enables us to optimize all our possibilities, right? So in terms of resources, in terms of manpower, in terms of skills, ideas, all innovations, all of these things. I'll add one more thing. I think also that for the agricultural system to particularly thrive, the role of the youth is a major factor that must be strengthened, right? So where we create a system that we get much more, we make it, and I'm struggling to use this word, but I'll still use it anyway. We make agriculture sexy again, where there's like, yes, we are farmers, right? We are not just support, we are actually farmers. And then and as a young person, you can feel proud to be a farmer again, right? And your parents don't feel like you're wasting your life, right? So you can, and this again, we are dreaming, but I think it's actually achievable. And the things that will make it achievable are part of the structures, frameworks that we've talked about, where we create a system that is open, transparent, inclusive, that caters to the extant needs, that actually context-driven and enables everyone to be able to play a role. I hope I've dreamt well.
You have. Dr. Dede, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing with us. Thank you for bringing those examples. Thank you for sort of educating us, because it's more like, for me, it's more like an education. Thanks for that. And thanks for not holding back. We look forward to maybe another episode in the coming year, to talk about the success stories and what we've achieved, from our last conversation. Thank you so much. And to our viewers, there you have it, another insightful episode. And you would agree with me that Dr. Odede had done justice to all the questions we've asked, as touching the use of AI technology to drive sustainable food systems in Africa and beyond. So I'd also want to encourage you, if you haven't already at this point, please follow us on social media, like our pages, follow us on YouTube, subscribe. In fact, turn on the notification bell so that you can know when we upload new episode. And we promise to always give you insightful, rich, and very educating and informative discussions generally on our podcast. And like we also mentioned, for the Young Scholars Academy, for those of you that have been following us already, very soon we'll open the second port for application to be open soon. So please stay tuned for that. You might want to follow us closely on our website where we make the announcement, and across our social media pages. So thank you once again for staying tuned, and I will see you again next time. Thank you and have a good day. Bye, everyone. Thank you.